Hey everyone, Dr. L here with your week 13 videos. So without further ado, let's jump into health as a social institution. So for this week's virtual lecture, I'll be doing housekeeping, review, lecture, exit paths, and reminders. Keep in mind the prompts and rubrics for all assignments, including discussion posts, especially discussion posts, as well as my AI policy. You had midterm exam 3 recently. Make sure you are emailing me about test corrections so that you can get details about how to complete those if that's something you're interested in pursuing. In terms of upcoming attractions, discussion 9 on public health is due this coming Sunday at 11:59 p.m. and so is chapter 9 quiz. As always, if you have anything you'd like to share with your classmates, feel free to email that to me and I'm happy to share your information to the entire class listserv. As far as review and check-in, if you have any follow-up questions about midterm exam 3 or about exams more broadly, make sure you email me or you ask in the exit pass, and I will do my best to respond to you individually or to the entire class, depending on the nature of your question. Remember, we have one more exam left before the end of the semester, so make sure you're asking those questions as needed. Similarly, if you have any questions about discussion posts, make sure you're emailing me or asking about that in the exit pass. I have been using the rubric more thoroughly for grading purposes, so make sure you're keeping regular track of your scores on eLearn, including your score and your comments I'm giving you. I'm taking off points when students don't follow aspects of the prompt and or rubric, and then I'm providing individual feedback to each student. So make sure you're taking that into consideration as we work on the remaining discussion posts. We do have a few more before the end of the semester. All right. As far as review from last week, we were focusing on education as a social institution. Now, this is something that I've talked about quite a bit in my virtual lectures throughout the semester, given the nature of my own research that has to do with higher education. However, I want to make sure we review this chapter before diving into our new content related to health. Now, I've talked about this or said this a few times throughout the semester, but sometimes as sociologists, we will use terms in an academic way, but we won't necessarily provide a textbook definition. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the terms we tend to use are terms that are used in our everyday lives. So I would argue education is one of those terms. But for our purposes, the textbook authors define education as a social institution through which a society's children are taught basic academic knowledge, learning skills, and cultural norms. And then from there, there's sort of two ways we break down education: formal and informal. Formal education is the learning of academic facts and concepts. This is probably what you think of, or the first thing that comes to most people's mind when they hear the term education. However, informal education is just as important, and I would say, as a sociologist, might be even more important. It's the education that involves learning about cultural values, norms, and expected behaviors through participation in a society. Now, we talked a little bit about this already in our unit related to socialization because, in a lot of ways, socialization is part of that informal education. Similarly, we have hidden curriculum and cultural capital. Hidden curriculum is the type of non-academic knowledge that people learn through informal learning and cultural transmission. And of course, this can happen inside and outside of the classroom, both in the K through 12 setting and in higher education. One of the main things we learn, or one of the most important things you can learn in terms of informal education, is cultural capital, which is cultural knowledge that serves metaphorically as currency to help one navigate a culture. Now, of course, these are just some of the terms that are covered in Chapter 16. It's an overview and a refresher, but you are responsible for all of the key terms in that chapter for midterm purposes. So make sure you're keeping up with that. Now, transitioning into our new content related to health and healthcare, first we have to understand, how is health important to the field of sociology? Well, in fact, there's actually an entire sub-study called medical sociology, which is a systemic study of how humans manage issues of health and illness, disease and disorders, and healthcare for both the sick and the healthy. Now, within that, there's sort of three main things folks tend to study if they're medical sociologists: health, health disparities and outcomes based on structural inequities, medicalization of folks from historically marginalized communities, and the lack of representation in medical studies and diagnoses. Now, the second one I'm going to highlight more in just a second on the next couple of slides, but the other two bullet points here we've already sort of touched on quite a bit throughout the semester, but just as a refresher, if we think about the medicalization of folks from historically marginalized communities, actually, I highlight this quite a bit on the next few slides, so I won't belabor that point yet. But the lack of representation in medical studies and diagnoses, I will talk a little bit about that just as a refresher. So I've brought up before, there was a journal article published in the late 1980s where the authors examined and did an analysis of high school biology textbooks. And they talked about how even though biology is this medical hard science, in fact, the way that authors write about biology is inherently biased, especially in terms of gender. And so we know that there's some interesting inequities happening when it comes to biology in the medical field. We also know there's a lack of representation, right? If you think about who works in healthcare professions, especially at the highest level, so doctors and things like that, it's still very much a male-dominated field. All right. So as far as medicalization, we have to think about health is socially constructed in the United States, especially when we're taking a sociological approach to the topic of health and healthcare. And so the medicalization process is where aspects of life that were considered bad or deviant are redefined as sickness and needing medical attention. Kind of honing in on that even more, the medicalization of deviance is a process that changes, quote, bad behavior into, quote, sick behavior, which can often lead to stigmatization, which is the act of spoiling someone's identity. They're labeled as different, discriminated against, and sometimes even shunned due to an illness or disability, which we've touched on a little bit in our ongoing conversation of the term intersectionality, because when we think about ability as an identity category, we know that stigmatization happens for those folks who may have a disability or a chronic illness. Now, we also talked about some of this stuff in our unit on the criminal justice system, because in the United States, we've seen as there's been a decrease and closing of mental health facilities in our country, we've also seen an increase in jails and prisons. And so that's what this image here sort of captures, this idea that treatment and support is equated to jail and punishment in the United States, despite the fact that we know that's problematic for a variety of reasons that we touched on in our unit on the criminal justice system. Now, we also have to think about the healthcare system. And of course, that requires us to think about commodification, something we've talked about in other units, for example, when we discussed education. But commodification is the changing of something not generally thought of as a commodity into something that can be bought and sold in a marketplace. And that very literally happens when it comes to healthcare in the United States. If you think about how healthcare operates in our country, you literally have to go to the marketplace in order to purchase healthcare if you aren't given the option to buy health insurance through your company that you work for. And so in that way, we sort of divide healthcare into two main parts: private healthcare and public healthcare. Private healthcare is health insurance that a person buys from a private company. Private healthcare can either be employer sponsored or direct purchase. So again, either you get it through your employer, or if you are ineligible for that, you have to buy it yourself on the marketplace. Now, public health care is health insurance that is funded or provided by the government. So this is something we don't see a whole lot of in the United States, but if you're familiar with healthcare systems in other countries, in some countries, this is sort of the norm. And so that gets us to socialized medicine, which is when the government owns and runs the entire healthcare system. Again, this is not something we really see in the United States, but it's quite common in a lot of other countries. Similarly, universal healthcare is a system that guarantees healthcare coverage for everyone, and oftentimes that is through socialized medicine provided by the government. Now, healthcare coverage has and continues to be a hot button topic politically and in the news. At any given moment in the United States, at least if you open the New York Times or another news outlet, there's a pretty good chance you're going to see an article that has something to do with the healthcare system. Especially right now, we just had the longest government shutdown in our country's history, and that has the potential to have a ripple effect in how healthcare coverage operates in the United States. So I encourage you to think about, have you read about some of these issues before, and are there any changes you'd like to see in the current healthcare system in the United States? Thinking about these questions will be useful as you work toward your week 13 assignment. So discussion post 9 and quiz 19. As always, here's a link to your exit pass. I will also email that out to the listserv. In terms of reminders, complete everything on our eLearn page for week 13. Continue reading the chapter on health and healthcare. Complete chapter 19 quiz. Complete discussion 9 on public health, including your response to 2 classmates. Other than that, have a great week, and I will make another virtual lecture soon.